Well, some of that comes from the Bible itself. We were kicked out of the garden. We screwed up. We were made homeless, according to that story. And whether you're a Christian or not, that's at the foundation of this culture. We were kicked out of our home. We became homeless. And in fact, the wages of sin are death. And we die because we really screwed up. We could have lived in the garden forever. But we screwed up so bad, we got kicked out, we became homeless, and we have to die. Now you could say, I don't relate to that very much. But how many of you, when you get sick, consider maybe you're being punished for something because you did something wrong? I do that sometimes. And that's fairly common. So that's not too far away from the wages of sin or death. You screwed up, you got sick. You did something wrong in the eyes of God, now you're sick. We'd never say that if you walked in the forest and you saw a tree with a cancerous sore on it. You'd never say, well, that tree obviously offended God. Yeah. Just like I've seen turtles that have big cancerous sores on their necks because they swim too close to the electrical plant where the water's warm and they get cancer. I never look at that turtle and go, well, man, you offended God. Or some of the more spiritual stuff that's going around these days is you created your cancer. Well, I think that's a very bizarre understanding of how it all works. I'm not saying we don't co-create what happens. We are participants. But to say we created our cancer to me is kind of blasphemous, especially if you say it to somebody who's already dealing with the challenges of finding out they have cancer. So if we don't start dying when we're born, when do you start to die? It's a big question, really. It's a big question. I mean, for a lot of people, we start to die when the doctor gives us the diagnosis. Because most of us are so disconnected from our bodies that we need somebody in a white coat to tell us we're dying. And of course, doctors don't want to tell us necessarily, just like sometimes there's a conspiracy at the hospital, don't let the patient in room 102 know that she's dying. And all the family members join the conspiracy. Why is that? Because we equate finding out you're dying and dying with suffering. That when you find out you're dying and you're dying, you suffer. So after sitting at the bedside for a couple of years and looking at what the funeral industry is up to in America, and what the cemetery industry is up to in America, and what the hospice movement is up to in America, I wanted to do something. I wanted to add a piece to it. So I talked to you about how death is considered and dying is considered a medical event. The medical world is telling us stories about what dying and death means. Do you know any of those stories? Anybody?
It's a failure of the medical profession.
It's a failure if you die. Their latest technology or drugs didn't work. And of course, their credo is, we'll try something else. We'll keep you from dying as long as possible. That becomes obscene, of course, which is why some of you are probably here when you're hooked up to a machine that'll make your heart work, make your kidneys work, and keep your liver function, and keep your lungs breathing, so that you don't actually have to die. And of course, this gets into the whole conversation of when is enough enough, and what is quality of life. Nobody's talking about quality of death, quality of dying, because we don't want to die. And the most common answer when I ask is, what's your picture of a good death? Fast, painless. Please let me die in my sleep. well, how are we gonna learn what dying is and how people die if they're all dying fast, painlessly, and in their sleep? How are we gonna learn? How are we gonna grow into what it means to die? And certainly, we may live to see where you can just go down to the store and get a pill. And in Oregon, that's probably gonna come sooner than anywhere else, because Oregon has been the most progressive about allowing you to choose when enough is enough. So what happens to the next generation and the next generation when dying becomes something you just take a pill and go to sleep? What does that do to us as a people and as a culture? It's a big question. So I worked very closely with a local hospice. I went to the executive director and I said, I want to start a nonprofit organization that works with sustainable, holistic, spiritually inclusive, community-based end-of-life care. Not that I want to bring in a whole new set of strangers and create an institution. Actually, I've started to use the share the care model, and we were doing these way before we even saw there was a share the care model. But in terms of creating community caregiving teams, the share the care, maybe you're familiar with the share the care model. There's a great book about it, and it's all the nuts and bolts. A woman created the nuts and bolts that you can download right off the internet of how to efficiently organize a caregiving team so where it isn't nobody burns out. Caregiving burnout may become the biggest crisis in America because people are dying now over long periods of time. The intensive care unit was developed 40 years ago when people were dying for the most part from accident, heart attack, stroke. Intensive care unit responded beautifully to those, saving somebody quickly. Now when people are dying from respiratory disease, heart disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, mostly heart disease and respiratory disease, and cancer, people can die for years. Intensive care unit is worthless. So unless you have a lot of money to hire round-the-clock care, what do? And maybe you ask your spouse or your kids to take time off from work to come take care of you, or as soon as they're done work, to come care for you. And I forget what the number is of how many work hours are lost now by people taking time off of work to take care of their dying family member. And that's a ticket for burnout if there's only one or two people taking care of somebody who's dying. And that's rampant. That burnout is rampant. And what happens when you're burning out as a caregiver? Who do you talk to about that? You sure don't go to mom who's dying and say, man, I'm burning out doing this. Because that burnout feels like nothing compared to the fact that your mom's in there dying. So sometimes that burnout turns into resentment. Could you just die already? And of course that resentment can turn into a tremendous amount of guilt for feeling resentful. A friend of mine was taking care of her mother for, I think it was 2 years. And she was up all night with her mom almost every night, and she wasn't sleeping, and it was making her nuts. And one night she was wheeling her mom in the wheelchair up to the top of the staircase to take her down the staircase. And she said to herself, wow, if I just let go of the wheelchair here, I'll get a good night's sleep tonight. Well, of course, as soon as she even had the thought, she was like, oh, I need help. I need some serious help here. So the share the care model and what we've been working on in our own communities is not to bring in strangers as caregivers, but to get you to invite all your friends and your family members together and maybe have a little party and get everybody to come together and sit down in this way and say, hey, we can do this. Who wants to do this? And who wants to do this in a way that it's not a burden or a burnout for any of us? And in fact, it's a beautiful thing. It's an exquisite thing. And we've seen it now a number of times. It's an absolutely beautiful thing. So I went to the executive director and said, I want to take care of this end-of-life piece, and I want to do the after-death piece. I want to do the care of the body. I want to have a cemetery and a crematorium. I want to transform the funeral industry and take it back And he said, don't do that. The hospice movement has a tremendous, fabulous reputation. The funeral industry and the cemetery industry have a horrible reputation. I went home, I thought about that, I was like, well, that's a good reason to do it. Because it really seems to me to be one seamless thing, all the way through. All the way through to either that burial or that cremation, or we do ocean body burial in Hawaii. And now we're starting to do home burial. That it's one seamless thing. We're not cutting it off at death. So I started an organization and started counseling people, and I went around to see how much coffins cost in Hawaii, and the cheapest coffin was $1,500. And it was made out of particle board, and it was made in China, and it was all velvety, so, you know, and I thought, well, gee, I could make a $400 or $500 a beautiful pine box coffin, and now I'm starting to, soon to be starting to use local Maui wood, and I'll sell simple, you know, coffins. Then I found out I didn't need to go to school to be a funeral director. I needed to jump through some hoops, and after a couple of years, the state finally said, okay, we'll recognize you as a funeral director. And the first thing, I went into the health department and said, hi, I'm your new local funeral director. And they already knew me. I've been a minister marrying people for years and years and years. And they already knew I was like strange. Oh, you're a funeral director. Well, what funeral home do you work at? Well, I don't work at a funeral home. I work directly in people's homes, and we go from the home, where we have a funeral right in the home, or right to the cemetery, or right to the crematory. And at the time, I developed a relationship with a crematory that would allow me to drive the body down in my beautiful 1983 hearse, and the family could either get in the hearse with me, and some of them did. They wanted to be in the back with the body, or they, you know, we caravan down there, and the funeral home let the family push the body into the crematory, and if the family wanted to press the button to start the fire, they did. And that was a powerful moment when you hear the fire go when the family member pressed the button. Powerful stuff. Since that time, that funeral home is the one that got bought by a corporation, big corporation, that said, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And so now I need to have a crematory, and I have somebody working on designing some kind of solar-powered crematory. I was thinking a big magnifying glass would be kind of cool. I mean, how many of us used to do that? So then, once the state recognized me as a funeral director, which is like 3 years ago, I thought, I'm going to open up a little office. I'm already counseling people, and I have my little coffin thing. I'll have a little coffin showroom. I started making little coffin furniture. I had the coffin table and the coffin bookcase. I say, make friends with your coffin before you're in it. I'll have a little showroom, and I'll have my office. I'll have funeral director services, and I counsel people. I do a lot of grief counseling, and grief. I think now it's kind of turned into grief teaching. I think we have plenty of grief counselors, and for the most part, grief counseling is about how to contain it and how to get through it. And I teach how to make it change your life for the rest of your life. Embrace it. And I could tell you things we're all grieving about, because I know we are. You know, I mean, I'm grieving those 14 Arizona firefighters. You know, how many of you are grieving the condition of the earth itself? How many of you are grieving what our government does in our name sometimes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I started a Monday night, first Monday of the month. We're going into the 7th year now. It's an open group called Being with Dying. Actually, I think I changed the name to Speaking of Death. Everybody's invited. And I say you're invited if you're dying, you're grieving, or you know someone who's dying, somebody died, or you might die one day. Now, people have been coming for years and years, some of them same people, lots of new people all the time. And what I discovered fairly early on was people want a safe space to grieve. a lot of us didn't get the opportunity to grieve for something that happened 40 years ago, and it's still in there. And it gets triggered when some fresh grieving shows up. And it gets triggered when our friend has something happen, somebody dies in our midst, and their grieving triggers our 40-year-old grieving that never really worked its way out. So I got to see right away that people are looking for space to grieve, and not just space, but safe space. It was kind of like when a little kid falls down and scratches their knee and starts to bleed and starts to cry hysterically and runs into her mom or her dad's arms, and it's just crying hysterically. And if the mom and dad see that it's not too serious, and they just wrap their arms around that little girl, that little boy, and they just hold that child, and that child just is wailing and wailing and wailing, and now, after some time, just having been held, maybe you've seen this, they just stop crying, get up, and run back to play. And that looks to me to be why a community is essential to grieving. That is a community event, that we want to be held in a safe community space by our friends and family, that we share it, that we don't go hide somewhere to grieve and try to make it private. Just like when we're dying, we tend to close into smaller and smaller circles because we think our dying is for us alone. So when I ask people what a good death is, 99 times out of 100, it's about what's good for them, not what's good for the village. Because we're still learning what it means to be village people. Because we weren't raised in a village, and that's one of the things we're grieving. Because in our DNA we have that memory of being born into a world where we were seen right away, and we were honored as special guests with special gifts to come and share. And the people around couldn't wait to see what gifts we brought. And we're so happy that we got here. And very few of us had that kind of entrance into this life. But it's in our bones, it's in our memory. Just like our ancestors are right here in our bones and our DNA. Because just like an apple seed, that apple seed contains every apple tree that ever happened has turned into that apple seed. That apple seed wouldn't be here without every other apple tree that came before it. And it's embodied, that seed is the final culmination of every apple tree. So all those other apple trees are here in that apple seed. Just like that apple seed contains every future apple tree there will ever be in that lineage. Which is exactly why our ancestors are sitting here with us. And that's why our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren are sitting here with us. And they're all looking to us, if you could imagine that. Because what we do not only affects the future, it affects the past. You can heal the past in the present. But most of us give lip service to the ancestors and don't have any real living connection to the ancestors. Why? Because when somebody dies, what do we say? I lost my dad. I lost my grandmother. That's the word we use all the time. And I've been to grief conference where lose, lost, and lost. Lose, lost, lose. All of those. Over and over again. That's the other piece I talked about. We see death through the lens of a medical event. But we also see it through a psychological. It's been psychologized. And it's all about loss. So of course, if you lost your dad, you lost your ancestors. But how did you lose your dad? I mean, yeah, I understand your dad died, but how did you actually lose your dad? You did it. You lost your dad. He didn't get lost. You could lose your wallet. You know what that feels like. That sucks. If you've ever lost your wallet, I've lost my wallet. You lost your car keys, you know how that feels. the same word. You've lost your grandma. Why?
In a restaurant.
And you know what? That turns out to be one of the biggest fears that we have when we're dying, is that we're going to get lost. We're going to get lost because we lost our parents and their parents. We're going to get lost, and what's going to become of me is the big fear. Is if is there going to be a me after we die? And the other part of that is, what do I leave behind? If I get lost, how do I leave something behind so I don't get lost? Well, of course, now what's gotten more and more popular is you make a DVD of what you want your kids and your grandkids and your great-great-grandkids to know. Why? Don't they know it already? Well, where have you been? Were you too busy making your bucket list? Which is a strange concept itself. That now you're going to really live because you want to make sure you do something before you die. You know, why do people with who've recovered from brain aneurysms or cancer say to me, "I never felt so alive"? Well, what are we waiting for? Are we waiting to find out? We don't have as much time as we think we have, that we may not get the 80 years this time around because other people die next week, not us. I haven't met those other people yet because, as far as I could tell, those other people don't think they're the other people. But it's the other people that die next week. But something happened to us. We can read in the newspaper that 10,000 people died over here, and these people just died over here. And I mean, we're pretty jaded to it now between the news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just kind of like, oh yeah, a couple thousand people died in this flood. And so we're a little bit, more than a little bit jaded. But what happens when you find out somebody you know is dying or died? Well, what happens to you is what happens to most people. All of a sudden, death is paid a visit, and your world has changed in some way. And usually those some ways are, life gets very fragile and precious and in the moment and real and authentic. And we cut out the crap. And I find funerals to be some of the most powerful community bonding and holy events I go to, because people get so real and present in that fragility that death has come close. Well, imagine if you lived that way, that you invited death to dinner every night, just to acknowledge that, sure enough, I can't assume I'm going to be around. Not to make us maudlin and depressed, quite the opposite, to bring us into full life and living. And I say you can't be fully alive if you don't have a healthy relationship with your dying and your grieving. You can't. Because it's right there anyway. And of course you could say, well, I'm not in denial about my dying. I know I'm not going to die. Okay, let's explore that a little bit. I mean, maybe there are some immortalists in the room, and I'm good with that. The question is, do you die? Or what dies? Now, if this is not us, and you say, well, this dies. Oh, and the mind? We're not even sure where the mind is, actually. We think it's the brain. We equate the brain with the mind. Although now that it's being proven that the mind is not just in the brain. People get organ transplants and start acting like the people they used to have the organ. The cardiologist in England who's been studying near-death experiences has watched when people have their brains flatlining and their hearts flatlining, and they were having an out-of-body near-death experience. And he asked the obvious question, where exactly are they having this experience? But certainly we think it's all about what's inside here. This is what causes us all the suffering we ever experience, which is why when people shoot themselves, when they commit suicide, the most common place they shoot themselves is in the head. This is the cause of the problem. So we get into this. We get into the discussion of, is this us or isn't this us? That's a great question. You could call it a religious question, really. I'm not going to answer it for you, but where I come from as a minister, I say that the Creator and the creation are not separate. That the Creator is manifesting through every square inch of creation. And that's what actually science is starting to show up now, that not only is the creation happening, the Creator happening in the creation, but that it's happening in a holographic manner such that in any square inch of space, the entire universe is replicated in that holographic, if you understand that at all. So, is this part of who we are? I mean, where is the soul? Where does it live? I mean, these are big questions. I'm not about to tell you, well, look, here's the answer. You know, I don't want to even come on as, look, I know the answers. But I found some good questions. And I think having a good question is way more powerful than me telling you what I think my answer is. Because that's just my answer. It might change next week. But I've looked at some great questions in terms of the things that we assume are true and don't even think about, and they're the elephants in the room. Just like this whole notion of competency, and what happens when you get old and your competency starts to decline. That's a big no-no in this culture. And you become useless. You're taking up space. Because my teacher would say we're competency addicted. Saying I don't know is, you know, an admission of weakness in this culture. We don't want to say I don't know. But certainly this whole notion of being skilled and competent, sure enough, shows up when people's competency starts to decline, and then we start to push them out of the way because they don't have any value. Actually, they have tremendous value. We have tremendous value. And instead of becoming invisible as old people and not catered to because we're not spending as much money on stuff as young people are, we need to be cultivated and honored for whatever wisdom we've managed to attain. And wisdom isn't just experience. You don't just get old and have wisdom. And you can see that in there's plenty of old people that have had tremendous amount of experience that don't have a whole lot of wisdom. And that's pretty sad for a culture where we've almost become wisdom and elder bankrupt. Just like the word sacred has almost lost its place in our culture. Just like when a culture a culture's story is that we were kicked out of our home and we're homeless, that's the culture that could eat the world, and does. Because we're not home. It doesn't matter what we do here. And certainly if you've moved a dozen times in your life or whatever, that just adds to a sense of feeling at home in a place. And that's why sometimes you see Indigenous people that look at us and feel sorry for us. And we may have everything, we think, but they can see that we're homeless. And Indigenous people who have been on their land for thousands of years are not thinking about going home when they die. They're already home. This is a pretty nice place, really. And this notion of being punished, again. Okay, I'm going to take a minute now and regroup and see where we are and see what's cooking and look at my notes a bit. I want to come back to this competency thing because sure enough, how does it show up? It shows up when we have to make a decision about whether someone is now incompetent. Right? That's exactly where it shows up. And now we can actually have a judge decide whether you are incompetent. So who's supposed to die? Who's supposed to die? Come on, who's supposed to die? What? Old people. Yeah, well, of course, everybody's supposed to die, but of course, we have it in built in that we think only old people are supposed to die.